My name is Daniel Hayes, PFC Daniel Hayes, though most folks just call me Dan. Or at least, they used to. Before Fort Ironwood. Before everything. My MOS is 250U Signal Support System Specialist. Fancy way of saying I fix radios, string cable, keep the lines of communication open. Usually. It's a decent gig. Predictable. You troubleshoot. You replace parts, you run diagnostics. Standard Army stuff. But there was nothing standard about Fort Ironwood. I ended up there like a lot of guys end up in weird assignments. Needs of the Army. That catch. All phrase that can send you anywhere. From a cushy desk job in Germany to some godforsaken hole nobody's ever heard of. Fort Ironwood was definitely the latter. Nobody I knew had heard of it. When my orders came down, sudden and vague, the guys in my old unit just shrugged. Never heard of it, Hayes. Sounds like you drew the short straw. One guy, a cynical specialist named Miller, joked it sounded like a phobit. Without the deployment pay, stuck out in the middle of nowhere, but technically stateside. He wasn't far wrong about the middle of nowhere part. The journey itself felt like shedding layers of civilization. A long, gray bus ride across state lines. Then a transfer to a humming olive drab transport truck that smelled faintly of diesel and old sweat. We drove for hours, deeper and deeper into the Pacific Northwest. The towns got smaller, then disappeared altogether. Paved roads turned to gravel, then just dirt tracks swallowed by trees. Ancient, towering pines and firs loomed over the road, their branches interlocking overhead, blotting out the sun even in the middle of the day. A constant, dripping dampness clung to everything, the air thick with the smell of pine needles and wet earth. It felt like driving into another time, another world. Fort Ironwood materialized out of perpetual twilight, under the trees like a bad memory. It wasn't much to look at. A collection of drab, utilitarian buildings, mostly concrete and corrugated metal, huddled together inside a high chain link fence topped with concertina wire. It looked old, neglected. Patches of rust bled down walls, paint peeled, and an unnatural quiet hung over the place. No shouting NCOs, no sounds of training. Discovered why. Just the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant hum of what I guessed was a generator. It felt less like an active military base and more like a place the Army had forgotten about, a relic of the Cold War maybe. Rumors back at my last post were non-existent, but the place felt like it had secrets. Maybe an old listening post, or one of those defunct experimental sites you hear whispers about. The architecture had that stark, functional look, built for purpose, not comfort. Checking in was subdued. A bored, looking staff, sergeant behind a counter barely glanced at my papers before assigning me barracks and pointing me towards the supply building. The few soldiers I saw moved with a kind of wary caution, their eyes darting around, conversations low and clipped. No friendly welcomes, no barracks humor, just quiet watchfulness. It put me on edge immediately. My barracks room was Spartan, even by Army standards. Cinder block walls painted a sickly green. A metal frame bunk, a dented locker, a single window looking out at the oppressive wall of trees just beyond the fence. I shared the space with a private named Chen, a kid barely out of ag, who seemed perpetually nervous, jumping at every unexpected sound. Our platoon sergeant, Sergeant First Class Riley, was a stern, tight-lipped man who laid out the rules, strict adherence to schedules, no wandering off designated paths, absolutely no unauthorized personnel near the perimeter fence after dark. His briefing felt less like standard procedure and more like a warning. My job as a 2050 U involved maintaining the base's communication systems. This meant I had reason to be in almost every building on the small post, from the command center to the motor pool, even some of the older, semi-abandoned structures out near the perimeter. It was during these initial rounds, settling into the routine, that I started noticing the little things. The wrongness that clung to Fort Ironwood like the ever-present damp. It started with the comms gear. Random bursts of static, sharp and loud, cutting through secure channels at odd hours. Not unusual in old equipment, maybe, but it always seemed to happen around 0:30, and sometimes, buried deep in the white noise. I thought I could hear something else. Whispers, clicks, fragments of sound that weren't human language. I ran diagnostics, checked connections, replaced suspect cables. Found nothing wrong. Chalked it up to atmospheric interference, old wiring. Standard troubleshooting. Then there were the lights. Flickering fluorescents are common enough on any base. But here, they'd flicker in buildings that were supposed to be empty, dark. I'd be walking back from the Chow Hall after dusk, and see a light blink on and off in the upper window of a storage building I knew was locked tight. I mentioned it to Chen once. He just paled and muttered something about faulty wiring, avoiding my eyes. Sounds, too. The woods surrounding the base were unnervingly quiet most of the time. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals. But sometimes, late at night, lying in my bunk staring at the ceiling, I'd hear things from just beyond the fence line. Scratching sounds like claws on metal. A low, guttural clicking. Once, I heard what sounded like something heavy dragging itself through the undergrowth, snapping branches. I told myself it was a bear, maybe a deer, but the sounds felt unnatural. Wrong. The isolation was the worst part. Miles from anywhere, surrounded by endless, silent forest. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the monotonous routine PT. Chow, work, chow, maybe an hour at the depressing MWR rec room. A single pool table with torn felt and a flickering TV. Then back to the barracks. The lack of normal base amenities, no bustling PX, no decent gym. Just the bare minimum made the place feel even more like a holding pen. The sensory monotony, the constant gray-green gloom under the trees, started to wear on me. You start to feel disconnected, like the outside world doesn't exist anymore. You get jumpy. Your mind plays tricks on you. Or so I told myself. I'm not easily spooked. Did my time, seen some stressful situations, nothing combat related, but enough to know how to keep my head. I wasn't some FNG fresh out of basic. But Fort Ironwood, it had a way of getting under your skin. The constant feeling of being watched was pervasive. Sometimes, working alone in an equipment shed, I'd get prickles on the back of my neck, spin around expecting someone to be there. Nothing. Just shadows and the hum of machinery. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me, the stress of the new posting. That's what I kept telling myself, trying to rationalize the growing unease, the little inconsistencies that didn't add up. But the feeling wouldn't shake. The feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. It was about 3 weeks in. I was on a late-night smoke break, standing just outside the barracks door, leaning against the cold cinder block wall. The only light came from the dim, yellow bulb above the doorway, pushing back weakly against the oppressive darkness. The woods were a solid wall of black just 50 yards away. Utter silence. Then, I saw it. Movement. Right at the edge of the tree line. A shape, tall and gaunt, darker than the shadows around it. It wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too still. It just stood there, watching me. My blood ran cold. I froze, cigarette halfway to my lips. My heart hammered against my ribs. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, convinced it was a trick of the light, my tired eyes playing games. When I opened them again, it was gone. Vanished. Like it had never been there. Just the trees. Just the silence. But I knew what I saw. And for the first time since arriving at Fort Ironwood, the rational explanations felt thin, useless. The unease I'd been feeling coalesced into something colder, sharper. Fear. Discovered why. The weeks following that night blurred into a routine of strained normalcy, punctuated by moments of escalating weirdness. The figure at the tree line became a haunting fixture in my mind. The baseline against which I measured every subsequent oddity. Rationalization felt increasingly hollow. Old wiring and settling foundations couldn't explain everything that started happening at Fort Ironwood. The subtle hints became bolder, more intrusive. Doors didn't just creak anymore, they slammed shut with violent force in buildings I knew were empty and locked. Soon discovered why. I'd be running diagnostics on a comms panel in the deserted motor pool garage, the only soul for 100 yards. And the heavy bay door would shudder and boom as if struck by a fist the size of a wrecking ball. Tools would clatter to the floor from workbenches I hadn't touched. Once, deep in the bowels of the main comms building, tracing a faulty line in a dusty, forgotten server room. Hoon discovered why. The entire rack of equipment beside me powered down simultaneously, not a tripped breaker, not a power surge, just dead silence and blinking red error lights that defied every diagnostic I ran. It took hours to bring the system back online, with no logical explanation for the failure. The sounds at night intensified too. The scratching became frantic, metallic screeches against the perimeter fence. The clicking evolved into guttural chitters and pops, sometimes sounding unnervingly close to the barracks windows. One night, a low, resonant humming started. Discovered why. Seeming to emanate from the ground itself, vibrating through the concrete floor of the barracks. It lasted for nearly an hour, a deep, unsettling thrum that made my teeth achy and my skin crawl. Chen was practically catatonic with fear, huddled under his thin wool blanket. Even SFC Riley looked pale and drawn the next morning, though he barked at anyone who mentioned the noise. My duties sometimes required checks on remote relay stations scattered deeper in the surrounding forest, especially as unexplained signal drops became more frequent. This meant night work, and night work meant NG's night vision goggles. Standard issue ANLPVS 114s. Anyone who's used them knows the world turns into an eerie, monochromatic green landscape. Depth perception gets tricky, and your field of view shrinks dramatically, leaving you vulnerable to anything outside that green tunnel. But the worst part is the visual noise, the artifacts, the scintillation, or snow, that dances across the image in low light, the occasional bright spots or flickering lines. Usually you learn to filter it out. At Fort Ironwood, it felt like the noise was hiding things. One night, checking Relay Station 3, about a click out from the main compound, the woods felt particularly oppressive under the NGs. The usual green snow seemed thicker, swirling. I kept seeing flickers of movement at the edge of my vision, shapes that dissolved back into the noise when I tried to focus on them. Was it just the goggles, the low light, my own paranoia? Or was something out there, using the visual clutter as camouflage? On the way back, I swept the beam of my helmet lamp across the path, then flicked on the NVGs again. For a split second, caught in the green glow about 20 yards off the trail, I saw it, 2 points of light, reflecting the intensified ambient, like animal eyes. But too high off the ground, too widely spaced. And they weren't green. They shone with a faint, internal luminescence, a sickly yellow-white. Then they blinked out. Gone. My breath hitched. I fumbled for my sidearm, heart pounding, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just the suffocating green, black woods. The NVG suddenly felt less like an advantage and more like a faulty filter over a terrifying reality. The oppressive atmosphere on base thickened. You could feel the fear, unspoken but palpable. Guys walked around with hunched shoulders and haunted eyes. Meal times in the chow hall were silent affairs. Everyone focused on their trays, avoiding conversation. Fights broke out over minor things. A couple of soldiers abruptly requested transfers, citing personal reasons. One guy, a mechanic from the motor pool, had a full-blown breakdown in the middle of morning formation, screaming about shadows in the walls before being sedated and shipped out for psychiatric evaluation. The official line was always stress, isolation. But we knew it was the base. It was this place. My own skepticism was long dead, replaced by a gnawing dread. Sleep offered little escape, filled with fragmented nightmares of green-tinged figures and crushing darkness. I started double-checking locks, keeping a K-bar knife under my pillow. The feeling of being watched was constant now, an invisible weight pressing down on me. I began to suspect the command wasn't just ignorant. They were hiding something. SFC Riley's stony silence, the captain's evasive answers to direct questions, the way certain areas of the base remained strictly off limits even for maintenance personnel. Like me, it all pointed towards a cover-up. The rigid military structure, usually a source of order, now felt like the bars of a cage, trapping us here with whatever horror inhabited this place. Reporting my experiences felt futile. even dangerous. Who would believe me? I'd likely end up like the mechanic, shipped off and labeled unstable. Fear, however, is a powerful motivator. I needed answers, needed to understand what we were facing. I started digging carefully. My MOS gave me access to comms logs and some network systems. Late at night, when I was supposed to be running routine maintenance, I searched archived files, looking for patterns in the signal disruptions, any mention of unusual incidents in older reports. Most records were frustratingly clean, almost too clean. But I found fragments, heavily redacted reports mentioning unidentified biological signatures, anomalous energy readings, and containment protocol breaches, dating back decades. Nothing concrete, but enough to confirm my suspicions that Ironwood's history was darker than anyone admitted. I also started talking, cautiously, to Miller, the cynical specialist I'd met early on. He'd been at Ironwood longer than most, and his cynicism seemed like a shield against the fear. He'd scoff and make dark jokes, but sometimes, late at night over contraband beers, he'd let things slip. Stories about guys who disappeared on patrol years ago, about sections of the base sealed after accidents, about strange lights seen deep in the woods. He warned me against digging too deep. Some doors are best left closed, Hayes. He'd muttered one night, his usual smirk gone. Especially around here. My cautious probing culminated in the event that marked the true discovery, the point of no return. There was an older, decommissioned comms bunker on the base's northern edge, strictly off limits. Rumor had it that it was part of the original Cold War listening post infrastructure. The official reason for it being sealed was structural instability. But the persistent signal interference seemed strongest near that sector. One rainy afternoon, using the excuse of checking a nearby junction box, I managed to slip away and pry open a rusted access hatch at the back of the bunker. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and the smell of decay and something else, something metallic and faintly rotten. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing banks of obsolete electronic equipment, thick cables snaking across the floor like dead pythons, dust motes dancing in the beam. I moved deeper inside, drawn by a faint, irregular clicking sound. It led me to a small, soundproofed room at the bunker's core. Inside, a single reel-to-reel tape machine sat on a metal desk, miraculously still powered by some auxiliary source, its reels slowly turning. The clicking was the tape spooling unevenly. Hesitantly, I flipped the monitor switch. Instead of audio, the machine fed into an old oscilloscope screen, which flickered to life, displaying a jagged, erratic waveform. Then the clicking stopped. The tape hissed, and a sound came through the built-in speaker, low at first, then rising in pitch and intensity. It wasn't static. It wasn't human. It was a cascade of wet, guttural clicks, sharp whistles, and a deep, resonating groan that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It sounded like something immense, something ancient and full of pain, or maybe hunger. It was the sound of utter wrongness given voice. As I listened, frozen, the hair on my arms standing on end, The oscilloscope pattern spiked violently. The lights in the bunker flickered, then died, plunging me into absolute darkness. The horrifying sound cut off, replaced by a sudden, deafening silence. And then, from the darkness right behind me, I heard a single, wet, drawn-out breath. I scrambled backwards, fumbling for my flashlight, heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I clicked it on, sweeping the beam wildly around the small room. Nothing. Just dust, shadows, and the silent tape machine. But the feeling of presence was overwhelming, suffocating. And the smell, that rotten, metallic stench, was stronger now, clinging to the air. I didn't wait. I bolted out of that bunker, not stopping until I was back in the relative safety of the main compound, gasping for air, drenched in cold sweat. I leaned against the barracks wall, shaking uncontrollably. Was it a recording? A malfunction? Or had I stumbled onto the source? The listening post that had picked something it shouldn't have, and was something still listening. I briefly wondered if the isolation, the stress, had finally cracked me. But the memory of that sound, that breath in the darkness, was too real, too visceral. It wasn't in my head. It was in that bunker. It was at Fort Ironwood. And it was aware of me. The encounter in the old comms bunker shattered any remaining illusions of safety or sanity. The wet breath in the darkness, the inhuman sounds from the tape, they weren't figments of stress, induced paranoia. They were real. Fort Ironwood wasn't just haunted or cursed, it was actively hostile, and it knew I was digging. The subtle dread morphed into raw, constant fear, but also a desperate resolve. I had to know what this place was, what we were trapped with. Staying passive felt like waiting for death. I wasn't alone in my terror anymore. Miller, the cynical specialist, sought me out the day after my bunker excursion. His usual sarcastic mask was gone, replaced by a stark fear that mirrored my own. "Heard you went poking around the north bunker, Hayes," he said, his voice low and strained. "Not smart, but I saw something last night, near the west perimeter. Big, fast. Not like any animal I've ever seen." He described a fleeting glimpse under the security lights, something hunched and multi-limbed, skittering back into the tree line. He also mentioned his comms gear going haywire simultaneously, emitting the same kind of distorted clicks I heard on the tape. My story about the bunker, the sounds, the breath in the dark, suddenly found a believer. We weren't the only ones. Chen, the nervous private I shared quarters with, became almost completely withdrawn, but sometimes, late at night, he'd whisper about things he saw moving outside the window. Figures that didn't match the shapes of trees or buildings. A handful of others showed similar signs. The 1,000-yard stares. The involuntary flinches at sudden noises. We formed a small, unspoken fraternity of the terrified, exchanging wary glances across the chow hall, sharing fragments of experiences in hushed tones when we thought no one was listening. Miller and I became reluctant partners in a desperate investigation. He knew the base layout better, the blind spots in patrols, the NCOs who were more likely to look the other way. I had the technical skills, the access, however limited to logs and systems. We started pooling information, referencing strange events with duty rosters and equipment malfunction reports. A pattern began to emerge, faint but undeniable. The phenomena seemed concentrated around specific areas: the Old North Bunker, a dilapidated research building designated Lab Delta on an old site map Miller acquired, and a specific sector deep within the surrounding woods marked only as Restricted Zone Alpha on perimeter charts. Our breakthrough came from Biolab Delta. It was officially condemned, boarded up tight. But Miller knew a loose panel near the foundation. One night, armed with flashlights, pry bars, and a shared sense of impending doom, we slipped inside. The place was a wreck: overturned tables, smashed equipment, rusted cages lining one wall. But in a back office, under a pile of debris, we found a water-damaged, leather-bound logbook. Its pages were filled with cramped, increasingly frantic handwriting. It detailed experiments conducted decades ago, during the height of the Cold War. The entries spoke of Project Nightfall, no designation I hadn't found in any official records, referencing attempts to weaponize some found deep beneath the base during initial construction. The early entries were clinical, detached, discussing tissue samples, biosignatures, unusual resonant frequencies, and attempts at behavioral conditioning. But as the dates progressed, the tone shifted to unease, then outright horror. Subject designated Ironwood anomaly, exhibits extreme photosensitivity and unpredictable aggression. One entry read: standard tranquilizers ineffective. Emits complex sonic patterns, possible form of communication or mimicry. Later entries described containment breaches, missing personnel, equipment failures linked to the subject's proximity, auditory hallucinations reported by staff mimicking voices, inducing paranoia. Read another chilling line, echoing the whispers I thought I'd heard. The final entries were barely legible scrawls. Containment failed, Delta sealed, God help us. Learnst. The log didn't explicitly state what the anomaly was: a creature discovered, an experiment gone wrong, maybe something tied to the strange local legends whispered about in connection with the deep woods. The Pacific Northwest is rife with tales of strange beasts, Sasquatch, Wendigo, things stranger still. Was this one of them, captured and experimented on? Or was it something created here? A byproduct of reckless science, like something out of the Manhattan Project's Forgotten Side projects or bizarre weapon attempts. The ambiguity was terrifying. The log confirmed the threat was real, intelligent, dangerous, and intrinsically linked to Fort Ironwood itself. Armed with this horrifying confirmation, we knew we had to warn someone, get help. We approached our platoon sergeant, SFC Riley, presenting the logbook, recounting our experiences. His reaction was colder than the bunker's darkness. He confiscated the logbook, his face an unreadable mask. You men are suffering from stress due to prolonged isolation, he stated flatly, his eyes hard. Confine yourselves to barracks. Further breaches of protocol or spreading these egg delusions will result in severe disciplinary action under the UCMJ. Is that understood? His dismissal was absolute chilling. It wasn't just disbelief. It felt like enforced silence, a deliberate cover-up. We were on our own. This was the confirmation Stage Carol described. We knew the monster was real, but authority refused to acknowledge it, leaving us isolated and exposed. The anomaly, as if sensing our discovery or Riley's inaction, escalated its attacks. It was no longer just bumps in the night or fleeting glimpses. One evening, Chen didn't report for evening cho. We found his bunk empty, his locker slightly ajar. A search revealed nothing until Miller spotted drag marks leading from our barracks window out towards the tree line. SFC Riley declared him AWOL. Despite the impossibility of anyone getting over the fence undetected, Chen was gone. Taken a few nights later, Miller and I were tasked with repairing a damaged sensor array near Restricted Zone Alpha. The woods felt alive around us, the silence replaced by constant clicks and rustles just beyond our flashlight beams. We worked frantically, backs pressed together, jumping at every shadow. Suddenly, the sensor array we were working on sparked violently, and a section of the perimeter fence near buckled inwards with a screech of tearing metal. Why? From the darkness beyond, something lunged. It was a nightmare silhouette against the dim security lights, impossibly tall, thin limbs moving with jerky, insect-like speed, a vaguely humanoid shape distorted wrong. It let out a chittering shriek that scraped raw nerves, a sound that echoed the horrors on the bunker tape. Miller shoved me behind him, raising his M4, shouting warnings. The thing paused, its head tilting at an unnatural angle, and then it spoke. Not with a voice, but with a perfect mimicry of SFC Riley's clipped tones. Confine yourselves to barracks, soldiers. The mimicry, the sheer wrongness of it, froze us for a fatal second. The creature lunged again, not at us, but sideways, towards the breached fence. It flowed through the gap and vanished into the darkness of Restricted Zone Alpha. Like smoke. We stood there, trembling. The smell of ozone and something else. That same rotten, metallic stench from the bunker thick in the air. The stakes were brutally clear. This thing wasn't just haunting the base. It was intelligent, predatory, and capable of mimicking voices, perhaps even thoughts. It was learning. And Chen's disappearance, the direct attack, it felt personal now. Understanding the why was a luxury we couldn't afford. Survival, escape, was the only thing that mattered. Fort Ironwood wasn't just a posting, it was a hunting ground, and we were the prey. The mimicry incident at the fence line was the final straw. Riley's stonewalling, Chin's disappearance, the logbook's horrifying revelations, it all painted a picture of a situation spiraling into absolute nightmare. Fort Ironwood wasn't just containing a threat. It felt like it was feeding it. Or perhaps the base was the threat, an extension of the anomaly itself. Miller and I knew we couldn't wait to be picked off one by one. Escape was the only option, UCMJ be damned. Survival trumped protocol. Our plan was desperate, bordering on suicidal. We needed to get past the perimeter, through miles of dense, hostile forest, hoping whatever lurked out there was less terrifying than what was inside. Our best Chance was scheduled weekly supply convoy. Create a diversion. Slip out in the confusion. Miller figured he could sabotage one of the generators near the main gate to cause a blackout, drawing attention. My role, using my 250U skills, was to disable the perimeter fence sensors and comm systems temporarily, blinding the command post just long enough for us to make a break for it. The night we chose was moonless, overcast, the air thick with impending rain. The base felt even more tense than usual, the silence heavier, charged with anticipation. We gathered minimal gear: MREs, water, knives, sidearms, extra ammo, flashlights, and crucially, our NGs. We knew we would need them in the pitch black woods, despite the terrifying artifacts and limitations they presented. 0200. Miller slipped out towards the generator shed. I made my way to the comms junction box near the main gate, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every gust of wind sounded like whispering. I worked quickly, hands slick with sweat, bypassing sensors, cutting feeds. The green status lights on my diagnostic tool winked out one by one. So far, so good. Then, the main lights flickered and died as Miller shorted the generator. Emergency lights kicked on, casting long, eerie shadows. Shouts erupted from the guard post. Perfect chaos. Go! Go! Miller's voice hissed over my personal radio before it crackled into silence. I'd cut local comms too. We met at a pre-arranged blind spot near the fence, a section obscured by overgrown bushes. Miller had already cut through the chain link. We slipped through, into the suffocating darkness of the forest beyond Fort Ironwood. We ran, stumbling over roots, branches whipping at our faces, guided only by the ghostly green glow of our NVGs. The forest was terrifyingly different at night, even through the goggles. Why? The limited field of view meant we were constantly scanning, jerking our heads left and right, trying to pierce the swirling green snow that obscured everything beyond a few yards. Every familiar shape seemed alien, menacing. Trees twisted into grotesque figures, shadows deepened into bottomless pits. And the sounds of the forest wasn't silent anymore. It was filled with clicks, rustles, snaps, and a low, intermittent chittering that seemed to follow us, always just at the edge of hearing. Sometimes sounding like it was coming from multiple directions at once. We pushed deeper, trying to put distance between ourselves and the base. Hours passed in a green-tinged blur of fear and exhaustion. The NVGs were a mixed blessing, essential for navigation, but the constant visual noise, the way familiar things looked monstrous, frayed our already raw nerves. Several times, Miller swore he saw movement paralleling us, a tall, spindly shape flitting between the trees, visible only as a flicker in the NVG's periphery. I saw it too, or maybe I just wanted to confirm his fear. My own mind painting horrors onto the electronic snow. Suddenly, Miller stopped dead, grabbing my arm. Listened. The chittering had stopped, replaced by something else. A voice. Chen's voice laced with panic. Help! Meg lost its hearing. It echoed softly through the trees, seeming to come from just ahead. It's the mimicry, I whispered, my voice hoarse. It's trying to lure us. I know. Miller breathed, his knuckles white on his M4. But what if? Before he could finish, the voice shifting seamlessly into SFC Riley's stern bark. Hayes! Miller! Halt! Return to base immediately. That's an order. Then, the most terrifying sound yet. My own voice, distorted, pleading. Dan. Is that you? I can't see, it's so dark. That broke us. We turned and ran blindly, crashing through the undergrowth, the mimicked voices swirling around us, mixing with the returning chitters and clicks. We stumbled into a small clearing, dominated by a massive, ancient-looking fir tree. And there, waiting for us, it stood. The anomaly. It was worse up close. Taller than I remembered, impossibly thin, limbs like bundles of dark wire ending in wickedly sharp claws. Its skin, where visible, was pale and slick, like a deep-sea fish. Its head was small, featureless except for a gaping, vertical slit that pulsed slightly. No eyes, yet we felt utterly, horribly seen. The air around it crackled with static, making our NVGs flicker erratically. The rotten, metallic smell was overpowering. It didn't move, just tilted its head, the slit pulsing. Then, it raised one spindly arm and pointed directly at Miller. Chen's terrified scream ripped through the clearing, seemingly emanating from the creature itself. Miller screamed, a wordless cry of rage and terror, and opened fire. The M4 roared, muzzle flash momentarily blinding me even through the NVGs. Rounds slammed into the creature, tearing chunks of pale flesh, but it didn't seem to react, didn't bleed. It just absorbed the hits, the torn flesh writhing, reforming. It let out that awful, bone-jarring groan I heard in the bunker, louder now, resonating through the clearing. It lunged impossibly fast. Not at Miller, but at me. I stumbled back, firing my sidearm wildly. The creature swatted the pistol from my hand like a toy. Its clawed hand reached for my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the end. A deafening roar. Miller had tackled the creature from the side, driving it back a few steps. They grappled, a horrific tangle of limbs in the NVG's green glow. The creature shrieked, a sound that shattered the night, and drove a claw deep into Miller's side. He gasped, collapsing. The creature turned back to me, the slit on its face pulsing faster. I scrambled away, grabbing a heavy branch, swinging it wildly. It connected with one of the creature's legs with a sickening crack. The anomaly staggered, letting out a high-pitched, whistling cry of what might have been pain. It hesitated, its featureless head swiveling between me and the wounded Miller. Then, with terrifying speed, it retreated, melting back into the trees and vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I crawled over to Miller. He was bleeding badly, his breathing shallow. "Go," he choked out, clutching his side. "Get out, tell thing." Leaving him felt like tearing out a part of myself. But he was right. I couldn't carry him. Couldn't fight that thing alone. Sobbing, I grabbed my pack and ran, plunging deeper into the forest, leaving Miller, Fort Ironwood, and the anomaly behind me. I don't know how long I ran. Days maybe. I lost the NVG somewhere along the way, ripped off when I snagged them on a branch. I stumbled on, fueled by terror and adrenaline, until I collapsed on the edge of a logging road. where a trucker found me hours or dehydrated, incoherent, babbling about monsters and mimics. They took me to a hospital, then a military psych ward. I told my story over and over. The debriefers listened patiently, nodding, taking notes. Then came the diagnosis: severe PTSD, stress-induced psychosis, hallucinations brought on by extreme isolation and sensory deprivation. They said Miller and Chen were officially listed as deserted, likely victims of exposure after going AWOL. Fort Ironwood, they claimed, was just a remote communications outpost, recently decommissioned due to budget cuts. No records of Project Nightfall, no mention of an anomaly. My experiences were dismissed, explained away. I got a medical discharge. Honorable, but with a file full of sick evaluations that ensures no one will ever truly believe me. I live quietly now, far from the Pacific Northwest, far from deep woods. But I'm not free. Sleep brings nightmares of green light and chittering sounds. Sometimes, late at night, the radio crackles with static, and I think I hear familiar voices whispering just beneath the noise. I see movement at the edge of my vision, tall, spindly shapes in the shadows. Was it all in my head, a product of isolation breaking my mind? Or did I escape something truly monstrous, something the army buried deep and refuses to acknowledge? I don't know. All I know is that I was a soldier at Fort Ironwood. And what I saw, what I experienced, it was terrifying. And sometimes, I get the chilling feeling that it's not over. That something followed me out of those woods. That the anomaly is still out there. Learning. Waiting. Listening.